let's go and just jump into this. I mean, it's a awesome book where you're doing extra TV because you've got this thing out,
That's right.
Autocrats and Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Order. That's frankly, one of the ideas is to advocate for your book and your ideas so people could understand your thinking and your expertise on this. We go back many, many years.
That's right. Tell
I
them
give you
about when we
credit.
go back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell everybody.
I give you credit for, frankly, getting me to the NSC. It was a conversation that you and I had in Spaso House with my cousin Jane visiting, doing a research project,
That's right. I remember her
having some
coming. Yeah.
coffee. And I was like, this is an interesting perch, the National Security Council. What do you think? And you were very encouraging. And that was basically, the 5-year trek to get there because it's a very, very weighty, lofty position.
Well, it's hard to get there. And you were obviously working in the government, a uniformed officer. So it's even harder to get there as opposed my way of getting there. I worked on a campaign and then got picked up by the Obama folks.
Yeah.
But I do remember us talking. I don't remember. Jane, of course, was, so everybody knows Jane's your cousin, right?
Yes.
Yeah, she's a former student of mine at Stanford, now a professor. And I do remember us meeting. I don't remember that pivotal thing, but to talk about glory days, I do remember that incredible trip we took to the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad.
Of course.
I think that was one of the most moving events of my time as ambassador. And you were marching around in your uniform. I remember that.
Yes.
With General Zwack, and people loved you guys. They had so much respect for the American military. Obviously, during the Battle of Stalingrad, we were all allies together. But you guys, and just so everybody knows, Alex speaks fluent Russian. He could interact with all these people, these soldiers that we met, these veterans we met. That was one of the best trips I ever took as ambassador. So
It was special. Of course, this was 2013, the beginning of 2013. And I also had the cachet of or the legitimacy of both of my grandfathers fighting in the Red Army and
right.
dying. So I actually, before I want to jump into this book, but I think people don't understand necessarily your deep background in region and field work. And I think it would be really just a quick overview of your trips to the region. What's
Yeah,
driven you
sure.
to be able to be such an authority on this place. You're not just a Stanford professor, or White House kind of DC animal. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I appreciate that. And I just got a note from our friends at MSNBC. I have to jump off at exactly at 4:58. So everybody knows that. But Alex, we should do this all the time. We should just do this. It's always fun to talk to you. I appreciate that question because it's a complex question that I don't get much of a chance to answer. And there's a couple of things that are important about my background that I think does give me a unique perspective, just like everybody's background does, and yours does. And you wrote a great first book about it, and then I see the other one, The Folly of Realism. We just everybody knows we agree philosophically on that. We'll get to that later, but there's a couple of things that really were formative. So I was a student in the Soviet Union. And I went there first in '83, then back in '85. And it was the winter of '85 that really flipped me against communism and against dictatorship. That's when I met for the first time Jewish refuseniks, Alex, by the way. I delivered a letter and just I realized, how awful it was that the regime was not letting these. That was, as I remember, it was a letter. Somebody had gotten into the LSE, but they couldn't get it there because the Soviets wouldn't let them. I met some dissidents. I also met corruption. I had a girlfriend in Florence at the time. She's not my wife, and she was a Stanford student studying at Florence, and it cost back then $72 to make a 6-minute phone call to Italy. So, and our stipend was $50 a month. So I had to work on the black market to figure out how to pay for those calls. Um, and what I did was we worked with tourists coming in to buy up their dollars, but then I would go to a berioska, as you remember that word, like a store that was just selling books in dollars. But I wasn't buying Solzhenitsyn. I was buying The Three Musketeers, a French
Mhm.
book, no political value. But then we would go sell that on the black market bookstore. And that's when I really saw the corruption.
Yeah.
So, first data point. Second data point that a lot of people don't know that I think had a big impact on the way I see the Soviet Union. I spent 2 summers in Poland in 86 and 87 as a TA for a Stanford program. And that's when Solidarity was underground. But I met them and I interacted with the leaders. So with a guy named Norman Davies, a historian. And, a lot of our profession, as you know, and probably in our government too, I don't know as well as you do in the government, have a very Russia centric, very Moscow centric view. But that experience made me see this other part of the communist empire, and I think gave me a different perspective. And then the third thing, yeah, I've been a professor for 30 years of my life, just so everybody knows. I was only in the government for 5 years. I write about American foreign policy. I used to teach courses on Russia. I haven't taught a course on Russia for a long time, actually. But I also teach courses on democratization more generally, and that gives me a different framework. And then the last thing I'll say, just because I just arrived in DC, just came from Cambridge last night. I got a couple of things I'm doing here. Um, but I'm oftentimes described as a, part of the foreign policy establishment and the blob of Washington. I just want everybody to know I only worked at the White House for 3 years. Proudly, by the way, I loved working there. There's no greater job than the NSC in my view. But most of my life were 20 years in Montana, 20 years in California, another 10 or so living abroad. So when I see people say, "Oh, this is a foreign policy establishment thinker," that's definitely not the way I think of my own career.
Yeah. So, I want to talk about the book. So, with short preambles, could you do a thumbnail of autocrats and Democrats and the theory of you talk about power regime type, individual actors, how those interplay. Could you could give a thumbnail that for folks?
Sure. And thanks for asking. So the book's titled Autocrats versus Democrats because I do believe that tragically, at this moment in our history, we're back into a battle between powerful autocracies versus democracies. And of course, lately, given some of the things that President Trump has been doing, I'm not always sure what side of that divide my country is on. I know what side I want it to be on, but I've never seen a more attacks on democratic institutions in my life than today. But that's the framing. But then I go through, in a lot of detail to talk about, is it like the Cold War or not? And my answer is yes and no. It's both. And I think just to think of it, especially with China, as just like the Cold War is wrong, but to say that it has nothing to do with the Cold War is equally wrong. And I go through 250 years of history to trace power, regime type, and leaders and how they change that sometimes made US China relations and US Russia relations cooperative and sometimes made them more confrontational. I won't try to go through all that history in the few minutes we have, but that I want to get at that as with my academic hat on. Then I compare power, ideology, and different conceptions of the global order between the United States, China, and Russia in the meat of the book. And when I add up all that data, I come out pretty optimistic. China is a challenger. It's going to be their greatest challenge we have for the 21st century. But I still think we have more power, especially if we're with our allies, military and economic power. I'd rather have the army they used to serve than the army of either of our competitors. Second, in the ideological competition, we are in an era of democratic erosion around the world and in our country, but it's still crystal clear that most people in the world still prefer democracy to dictatorship. So I like our odds with our ideas, um, but the book ends with some prescriptions because we're at this moment where not everybody agrees with my strategy for advancing our interests, which is engaging, having allies, and participating in international institutions and promoting our ideas. And on those three big debates, you know these debates well, but I'm going to oversimplify, right? There's the debate between isolationists and engagement. I think we can advance our interests better by being engaged in the world. President Trump is more of an isolationist. Second, when he engages in the world, he likes to do it in a unilateral way. I think we're better off doing it in a multilateral way, especially with allies. And then third, on the ideological piece, he just doesn't believe in promoting democracy. I mean, let's be clear about that. You knew that working for him. You saw that up close and personal in a way I never did. He kind of divides the world between what he thinks are strong leaders and weak leaders, or people that praise him and people that don't. I just think that's a very imprudent strategy for defending our interests over the long haul.
So, this comes up in, and you and I think, battle with others on this issue. I would be curious to hear your definition on maybe including time horizons on the Russia and China threats. How would you categorize them? Acuteness in what time horizons are we destined for confrontation? Though, wrap that up, please.
So let me say two things and then the destined for war piece. So China has way more capabilities than Russia on almost every dimension, save, the only one they don't is nuclear weapons, right? And I go through in the book, I have lots of charts. By the way, Alex, my editors didn't like all those charts. They're like, nobody cares about charts. I care about
I saw
charts.
the 1,000-page version.
Yeah, you did. You did. That's right. So I did cut back a lot and cut a lot of footnotes, but they have more capabilities, and we got to deal with those capabilities seriously and soberly. I don't walk away from that, but I think what we sometimes get wrong is if we just focus on capabilities and leave out intentions, we don't have an accurate threat assessment. And the problem with Putin is he doesn't have as many soldiers and he doesn't have as much money as Xi Jinping does, or for that matter, the United States. But he has proven tragically that what resources he has, he's willing to use in really horrible ways for the free world. He invaded Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. He deployed his air force to prop up Assad in 2015, and then launched his full-scale invasion in 2022 of Ukraine. And that's just showing that it's his will, it's his risk-taking behavior that we got to take seriously. And I think, including myself, from time to time, we've underestimated that, and that's caused us a lot of troubles.
Yep. So that's really, it's the capabilities and intent that I often find myself talking about. And yes, Russia's capabilities are uh, pale in comparison to China's, but its will to use its limited capabilities in a highly aggressive manner is what makes it, to me, kind of the immediate acute threat,
Yeah.
and something that China's watching carefully to figure out how folks react to. So,
Yes.
um, it's
But that, Alex, that really important point you just said, the acute threat. That is a very important thing. That they're both threats, but the one that's front and center is the Russian one, and that we underestimated that, and then we didn't do enough to push back on it. I know you and I agree on that. That's where we made mistakes.
So, you kind of hit this a little bit already, but the scorecard doesn't look awfully bad for the US. I mean, there are certainly challenges, whether it's an acute threat or, the term in government is pacing threat with regards to
Pacing
China.
threat. Yeah, right.
Um, there's a calibration around how much competition, cooperation, and so forth we need to do, but it doesn't look awful. I guess to a certain extent, what is it that we should be doing with regards to Russia and China, and recognizing that frankly, this administration is discarding the lessons of the past and magnifying, amplifying the mistakes of the past. So maybe you could touch on both sides of that.
Yeah, great question. So first, I agree with your analysis in the whole, right? If you look at everything, I'd much rather be on team democracy than team autocracy. I think in the long run, we got more resources, we got better ideas. Second thing I would say on that score is it's only going to be that case if we use our resources effectively, right? And that gets me to the second part of your question. And I just think President Trump is squandering some of our instruments of influence and power. So let's just go through them a little bit. USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development. And remember in the book, you already said it, but I want to underscore it. I go through the Cold War. I do the compare and contrast to help understand, are we in a new Cold War or not? Well, when did USAID get created? 1961, the height of the Cold War. John F. Kennedy. Why? Because he thought we needed this instrument to compete with Soviet economic assistance around the world. And Trump just blew it up overnight with Elon Musk's help for no apparent reason. And yeah, I got it. There were some stupid grants. We all agree about that. But the response to that should have been reform, not destruction. Uh, the National Endowment for Democracy. So I want to be nonpartisan, right? Kennedy, he was a Democrat. Reagan had this great idea to create the National Endowment for Democracy, did a lot of great work around the world, still does. 1982, he made the speech to create it, to counter Soviet support for their communist ideologues around the world. And now President Trump and his supporters, they want to shut it down. It's just a mistake. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, other instruments of American power, they're shutting them down. And I don't understand why, because I can tell you the Chinese aren't doing that. The Russians aren't doing that. Putin's not saying, oh, America, you're shutting down Voice of America. I'm going to shut down Russia today. He's not doing that. Oh, America, you're shutting down USAID. We're going to stop the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese saying that. If they're not doing it, why are we doing it? And then the last one is about, there's a long list, but the one I should have started with is about allies and multilateral alliances. That was so critical to us in winning the Cold War. And President Trump, for reasons I really don't understand, doesn't value allies. He makes jokes about invading Greenland or making Canada the 51st state. Well, I can tell you, I grew up on the Canadian American border in Montana. I have Canadian friends. They don't think it's funny, and they don't like it. And when you're a powerful country, you can bully weak countries for a while, and sometimes they just have to go along because they don't have any choice. But they don't like it, and eventually, if you do it for too long, they're going to find ways to find other friends in the world. And so
Yeah.
I just think these are very short term, kind of sugar highs that they get, but in the long run, not very smart. And then I want one last thing about China. Bullying doesn't work with China. I think the president just proved that over the last week. He thought he was going to be tough and put sanctions on them and this and that. Well, they got some levers themselves, and in that game of chicken, we just got off the road, and that doesn't make us look strong around the rest of the world. That makes us look weak.
Sure. So you actually you hit the topic. Why don't you expand a little bit on the Trump Putin meetings, just to bring in a little bit of current events and how we stack up, or how Trump stacks up with regards to these two autocrats.
Well, as you know better than I, because you served with President Trump, you know that he's had this obsession with Putin for it goes back a long, even before he was president, and a kind of ideological affinity, and he could never criticize him. And most famously at that Helsinki summit in 2018, he said, "I agree with Putin. I don't agree with the CIA."
First day on the job at the NSC.
Seriously?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Wow. What a way to start.
Yeah.
That was a crazy day. I was actually in Helsinki working for NBC.
Yeah.
That was a crazy day. That was also the day that when Putin said to Trump, we have this MLAT treaty and we would like to interrogate some of your Americans.
I
Trump
remember.
said that's a great idea. And I only learned the following day, but I was on that list. But I don't want to get distracted on that. Um, uh, that has been consistent until recently. And I think Trump thought he could just give Putin everything he wanted. and he could end the war. And Putin saw that as a sign of weakness, and so he asked for more. I mean, the most crazy thing he asked for was to have Trump call Zelensky to get Zelensky to withdraw his soldiers from the parts of Donbass that they occupy. I mean, think how kooky that is. And he overreached, right? He just asked for too much. So I see in the way that the president's talking that it seems like he's finally getting it. And he's done a few incremental things. He sanctioned a couple of companies. I applaud that. What I don't know is, will he really change policy? And honestly, I'm kind of skeptical.
Mm.
I just think he'll go back. Putin gives him a call, and then suddenly, he's going to fly to Budapest, and he's taken away the tomahawks. He's very mercurial when it comes to Putin. So I don't have a lot of faith in
Sure.
whether he has what it takes to do what is necessary, which, in my view, if you want to create the conditions for a ceasefire, you got to give Ukraine more and better weapons, and you got to implement more and better sanctions.
Yeah. So we could talk. There's a bunch of stuff I want to talk about. You and I are like-minded on the fact that we need to focus in on allies, values, primacy. Focusing on the long term, being less transactional. This sounds familiar because you sat in on my doctoral dissertation. You on my committee,
Yes,
but
yes,
being
with
mindful
great
of
honor.
time. I would like to hear your thoughts on, it's about the autocrats and Democrats. What is your thinking on the health of our democracy? What can you say about that and democratic reforms that are necessary? Because I think that's on everybody's mind in this moment
Yeah.
where we seem to be under enormous pressure. And you could take us all the way through the last few minutes here.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a great one to end on. So, we have been in a democratic recession for about 11 years, according to Freedom House. We got a little bit of an uptick in the last year of Biden. I predict with great certainty that the number is going to sink after the first year of the second Trump administration. And in my lifetime, there's never been a greater challenge to democratic institutions than today. And I don't claim to be an expert on American history, but I have lots of friends at Stanford who are, and they say you got to go back to the Civil War to remember a time as precarious as this. So that's the objective. And I'm sure you've talked about all the erosions and all the things that are happening. They're scary, and Trump wants to just accumulate more and more power, and he won't stop unless he's stopped. And I saw this playbook in the early Putin years. I know what it looks like, and Putin wasn't stopped. What gives me hope is three things, and I'll end on this. They're pinging me right now. You know how it is with these TV folks; they freak out, right?
Hmm.
They're freaking out right now. I'm going to tell them I'm on with Alex. Just
Hmm.
chill for a minute. Three things give me hope. One, our institutions checking autocratic power are stronger than they were in the early Putin era. Independent media, Democratic Party, governors, civil society. That I think is an objective fact. Two, Russians had only had a little bit of a few years of democracy when Putin came along. We've had 250 years of it. And I think those principles are deep in American society. And you saw it with the No Kings demonstration. And it was called No Kings on purpose, right? I think Trump, I think is grossly underestimating the depth of those ideas. And I feel that, Alex, when I talk, I'm giving this book talk, and I was in South Carolina last week, Texas. Before then, I'm heading to Ohio and Pennsylvania. I'm going to a lot of red states. I'm going to Montana and Idaho. And anytime I talk about this, I feel like we got to disagree on tax policy, between Democrats and Republicans, but we shouldn't have fights over the democratic rules of the game. That's when I get the biggest applause lines. But the last thing is you got to fight for democracy, and small d Democrats have to fight. And what gives me hope is people like you. Russia didn't have enough Alex Vindmans when Putin was rolling things back. We got a lot of brave Americans against tremendous odds and danger to their careers, and sometimes even physical danger, are fighting for democracy. And so as long as there are Alex Vindmans in America, I'm feeling pretty good about our odds.
Awesome. Well, it's great seeing you. I know you got to run.
I got to
I
run.
look forward to the next time. This is the book, Autocrats versus Democrats. It just came out on Tuesday. I managed to get through it. It's a really interesting read on the historical notes as well as the prescriptions. So appreciate you joining me, and best wishes with this one.
Thanks, Alex. Let's do it
Thanks.
again. Okay. All right.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Hey, thank you all for joining me. About 700 of us here. I'll post this back up. A lot more to cover, frankly, on this. There's a lot of topics that we didn't quite get to. I wanted to hear more about the scorecard because if you read the book, it's not just kind of wishful thinking. It's a deep analysis on where the advantages and the shortfalls are. This idea that like we're predestined for confrontation with China, this idea of like you know, through cities trap, realism that, rising powers, waning powers are destined for confrontation. I think it's important. He's got an important perspective on that, are worth taking a look at. He talks about democratic reforms. I think that's an important place to look. It's something that I find myself talking about pretty regularly. What can we do to make sure that our democracy stays relevant to the American public, not just elections. There tend to be more of them than people think. It's not just the first Tuesday in November. There are special elections. There are primaries. There are local elections, but that might still not be enough. There are other ways to participate in a democracy. I think No Kings, to me, is one of those ways. That's how our founding fathers designed our system with the First Amendment. The idea that when the government turns, when you're displeased, let alone when the government turns tyrannical, that your obligation as an American is to show up and to protest. That's what our founding fathers wanted. And frankly, that's why it's number one on the list. There are other component to this. I think we'll probably do a part two as Mike McFall, Ambassador McFall, eases out of some of this launch week. I know what that's like. I'm still traveling. Next week, I've got Wisconsin, Seattle, and Idaho on my list of places to go. So once he's out of that hot phase, we could talk again. And he's always quite insightful on great power competition on Russia and China. Uh, just for those that are, I've got a post coming out tomorrow, the a monthly security update. I'm paying attention a lot more to what's going on in Venezuela. The carrier strike group is really moving into position. We are on the cusp of something super dangerous. I'm trying to see through my work with Vote Vets and the Vet Voice Foundation and think tank if there's something that we could do to arm Democrats and reasonable Republicans to push back on this adventure that could open up Pandora's box in our own hemisphere, another confrontation. Um, so those are all on the plate. But again, thank you for joining and looking forward to catching you next time. Take care.